there's a huge issue that I see and have seen for years in our industry, which is the race to the bottom, where there has been this arbitrary nickel and diming where the next shop down the street will just take your price and knock 25 cents off of it just to get a job, but they're not using any data to support their pricing. There's so many companies that generate their pricing matrix that's based off of other people's companies, and it's not based off of what their actual overhead and profit margins need to be to continue to exist as a company. And I think that the hard lesson that was learned in 2020 was the shops that didn't know their numbers and didn't know how to pivot correctly are the ones that got in the biggest trouble the fastest. And I think that we're seeing that now in reverse with the larger companies, because they're flying at the seat of their pants most of the time. And shops like us, where we have the data and we are very lean. We are a lean company, and I don't like flying off the seat of my pants anymore because it's too scary. It keeps me up at night. I got 2 kids and a wife, and I can't just wing it anymore and hope that it works out.
How did you get to a point where you felt like you were pricing profitably? Because, we started our shop and I did exactly that. I mean, I literally got the shop down the street's pricing matrix and said, okay, this is basically ours.
So for us, our original pricing matrix, the way that we came up with it is I went on Google and I Googled screen printing price list and actually did a Google image search. And I downloaded and printed out 50 or 60 screen printing price lists that were on Google Images at the time. This is 2008, 2009, something like that.
Yeah.
And downloaded every single one I could find for pretty much all of the US. And I meticulously went through all of them and created a price list that was a literal national average of what I had discovered on Google Images. And then I subtracted 5% from that pricing so that in my mind at the time, I'm like, well, I'm going to be 5% cheaper than the national average. But that's a totally ridiculous way to create pricing because it was not based on my business whatsoever.
Right.
It didn't reflect what my overhead was. It didn't reflect any type of scaling or profitability whatsoever. It was totally arbitrary. And worse, it was completely based on other companies and how they operated. And some of these price lists could be from anywhere from the guy who's printing shirts in his garage to a shop that has 7 or 8 automatics. So there's no way that any of that would be directly relatable to how my company was operating at the time. So it wasn't until the switch was when we started actually collecting the data and actually
like a time study or because it is tricky, right? Because depending on your volume, your overhead, how did you go about that process?
So the first thing we did is figured out what our actual true overhead was. Sitting down and just doing the math, having your books correct, having your P&L correct and up to date, and then tracking everything that a lot of people don't track. How many screens can you coat with a gallon of emulsion? What is the true cost to expose one screen? The
based
actual
on your
number.
True overhead.
Right, based on the true overhead of how you do it. Do you have an autocoder? Do you have a CTS? Are you coding everything by hand? How often how many screens do you have in your cycle? How many screens do you have in your shop? Is the overhead, is the cost of creating one screen higher because you're reclaiming every day because you don't have enough screens in the pipeline to do it in any type of batch work, or automation is huge? Do you have an auto reclaimer, or do you just have a high school kid that comes in one day a week or one day a month? Or is it you?
But how do you take that true cost to apply it to that? Like, obviously, if you said, here's all the money that I spent, excluding cost of goods sold, and then are you dividing it by the time spent on different areas of that job? Or finding, right, as this foundation here?
Right. So what we did is we just applied it to the volume that we were doing at the time. We're looking at the number of jobs we're doing on a monthly basis, and finding the average, because
Got it.
finding the average of how many total jobs we're doing every day, or on a monthly basis, is how we calculated it. On average, how many screens are we producing on a monthly basis? How the cost of supplies and materials, and then labor, and then your main overhead if you're leasing a space or you've got a mortgage on it, and then insurance and everything else that comes along with it. How much is your phone? How much is your internet? How much you spend on Post-it notes every month? And figuring out how many dollars are going out, and then you can actually create your pricing off of, well, on an average basis, we're going through X number of screens at a cost, an actual overhead cost of this. So when we do a one color print, that screen, depending on how your shop is set up, it could be $5 is your true cost to expose one screen. When you consider labor from blank mesh to blank mesh, from blank mesh to coat, film or CTS, exposure, washout, dry time, the labor of the person that's doing that, and the electric, the building that it's in, and so on. When you calculate that and actually find that number, you can figure out what it costs to make one screen.
So my guess is that this exposed some flaws in the Google template screen printing matrix theory.
Yeah, major flaws. Because at that point, we were just making everything up.
Sure.
And because largely our pricing was totally based on other shops who were mostly much larger operations than we were at the time.
Was the flow from there then to run example jobs and say, here, okay, we know our average order volume per month as far as number of jobs. Here's 3 or 4 example types of those orders. And then making sure that based on the true cost of running the business, that each of those would be profitable if you multiplied it out by the total number of jobs a month. Right.
It just became about keeping track of time mostly. And then even as simple as one of the first things we did is we put a notebook in the dark room, and every time we coded screens, we just wrote down the date and how many screens we coded. And then we did that until the bucket of emulsion was empty. And so we knew this month we coded X number of screens with 1 gallon of emulsion. The cost of emulsion is this. That got us this many coded screens. And it's a very painstaking process, and it takes a lot of patience and more so discipline. You have to make sure that you're actually doing that. And then the next thing was timing jobs. How long does it truly take to set up a 1-color front, black ink, or 1-color front, white ink? And then what about a 2-color print? What about a 3-color print? Instead of just arbitrarily saying, well, a 1-color print's $3, and a 2-color print's $3.50, and a 3-color print's $4.
Right.
Well, does 50 cents, these arbitrary increases, is that actual true reflection of what your overhead is and your profit margin is? Or is that just something you made up? And because it makes the math easy to do. And we don't have it right now, but one of the things that I'm super interested in looking into next is breakless pricing, because I think that's brilliant. And figuring out whatever the math is going to have to be to make that work.